The steam rose from the industrial coffee machine like morning mist over a battlefield, and Sarah Martinez watched it with the same intensity she once reserved for scanning hostile terrain through night vision goggles. Her hands moved with practiced precision, muscle memory guiding every motion as she prepared the first batch of the day. Outside the small coffee shop window, the California sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. But Sarah had been awake since 0400 hours. Old habits die hard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Bell and Grind Coffee House wasn't much to look at from the outside. A modest storefront squeezed between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner in downtown San Diego. But for Sarah, it represented something she'd never thought she'd have again: peace. Or at least the closest thing to it that someone with her past could hope to achieve. She'd bought the failing coffee shop 18 months ago with her disability settlement, determined to build something quiet and predictable after 15 years of anything but. Sarah's reflection caught her eye in the chrome surface of the espresso machine, and she instinctively turned away. Even after 3 years of civilian life, she couldn't get used to her own image without the desert tan uniform, the Kevlar, the weight of responsibility that had defined her for so long. Now she wore simple black slacks and a burgundy apron emblazoned with the shop's logo, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail instead of the tight regulation bun she'd maintained throughout her military career. The morning routine was sacred to her. She'd arrive at 0500, an hour before opening, and spend 60 minutes in solitary preparation. Coffee beans needed to be ground, pastries arranged in the display case, the register counted, and most importantly, her mind needed to be prepared for the day ahead. The early morning customers would start trickling in around 600 hours. Construction workers grabbing coffee before heading to job sites, nurses finishing night shifts at the nearby hospital, and the occasional insomniac seeking refuge from their restless thoughts. As she wiped down the already spotless counter for the third time, Sarah's sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of a scar that traced along her left forearm like a jagged lightning bolt. She quickly tugged the fabric back down, a reflexive action that had become as automatic as breathing. The scars were everywhere, some visible, others hidden beneath clothing, and still others that couldn't be seen at all, but ran deeper than any physical wound ever could. The bell above the door chimed its familiar greeting as the first customer of the day stepped inside. Mrs. Patterson, a retired school teacher who lived in the apartment complex across the street, had become as regular as sunrise itself. She ordered the same thing every morning: medium dark roast, 2 sugars, splash of cream, and a blueberry muffin if they looked particularly fresh. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness that had taken months to perfect. "The usual?" "You know me too well, dear." Mrs. Patterson's weathered face crinkled into a warm smile. "How are you holding up? You look tired." The observation was innocent enough, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been having the dreams again, the ones where the desert sand turned to concrete and the coffee shop became a compound in Kandahar, where the morning rush transformed into incoming mortar fire and the hiss of the espresso machine became the whistle of artillery shells. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. "Just a busy week," Sarah replied, forcing her smile to stay in place as she prepared Mrs. Patterson's order. "Nothing I can't handle." The lie came easily. She'd been telling variations of it for 3 years now, ever since she'd been medically discharged from the army after the incident in Afghanistan that had earned her the Purple Heart and cost her much more than she'd ever be able to explain to civilians. The physical wounds had healed, mostly, but the invisible ones seemed to have roots that grew deeper with each passing day. As Mrs. Patterson settled into her usual corner table with a dog-eared paperback romance novel, Sarah found herself studying the morning crowd with the same analytical eye she had once used to assess potential threats in hostile territory. The businessman in the expensive suit checking his phone, probably harmless, but his constant glancing toward the door suggested anxiety about being late for something important. The college student with the heavy backpack and tired eyes, clearly pulling it all-nighter, no threat assessment needed. The woman in scrubs grabbing coffee before what was likely a 12-hour shift at the hospital, Sarah felt a kinship with her, recognizing the particular brand of exhaustion that came from high-stress work. But it was the three men who entered at 065 hours that made Sarah's entire body tense with recognition, even though she'd never seen them before in her life. They moved with a fluid precision that spoke of military training, their eyes automatically scanning the room's exits and blind spots before they even approached the counter. The way they positioned themselves, never standing directly in front of windows, always maintaining clear sightlines to the door, was unmistakable to someone who'd been trained in the same protocols. The first man was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of countless hours under harsh foreign skies. His hair was regulation short, and despite wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. The second was built like a linebacker, his massive frame somehow managing to move with surprising grace. The third was smaller but radiated the kind of coiled energy that Sarah recognized from her time with special operations units. "Good morning," the tall one said as they approached the counter, his voice carrying just the hint of a southern accent. "We'll take 3 large coffees black, and whatever you've got for breakfast that won't slow us down." Sarah nodded and began preparing their order, hyper-aware of their continued surveillance of the shop's layout. They weren't being obvious about it. To most civilians, they would have appeared to be 3 friends grabbing coffee before work. But Sarah could read the signs like text on a page. These weren't ordinary customers. "You boys look like you're up early for a reason," she said casually, testing the waters as she filled their cups. The big one chuckled. "Early? This is sleeping in for us. We've been up since 300 hours. The casual mention of military time confirmed Sarah's suspicions, but she kept her expression neutral as she handed over their coffees and a selection of breakfast bars. As they moved toward a table near the window, Sarah caught the tall one studying her with the same analytical intensity she had been applying to them. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his gaze lingering on her face for just a moment too long. "This place has good atmosphere. Feels secure." The word choice was deliberate. Sarah was sure of it. Civilians don't describe coffee shops as secure. They talk about atmosphere, ambiance, comfort. But security was a military concern. She watched them settle into their chosen seats, noting how they positioned themselves to maintain overwatch of both the entrance and the rear exit that led to the alley behind the building. For the next hour, Sarah continued her morning routine while trying to ignore the growing sense that something fundamental had shifted. The 3 men drank their coffee and spoke in low voices, their conversation indistinct but punctuated by the kind of acronyms and abbreviations that belong to classified briefings rather than casual morning discussions. They left just after 8 hours, the tall one pausing at the counter to leave an unusually generous tip. "See you tomorrow." And he said it, and something in his tone suggested it was more than just polite customer service conversation. After they left, Sarah found herself standing motionless behind the counter, her hands gripping its edge so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd spent 3 years building a life that was deliberately ordinary, systematically removing anything that might connect her to the world she'd left behind. She'd chosen San Diego partly because it was a military town where veterans could blend in without drawing attention, but she'd been careful not to avoid the areas where active duty personnel frequently gathered. The coffee shop was supposed to be neutral ground, a place where she could serve civilians their morning caffeine fix and pretend that Sergeant First Class Sarah Martinez had never existed. But the 3 men who had just left told her that they weren't going to let her maintain that fiction much longer. As she mechanically went through the motions of serving the rest of the morning rush, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the past she'd worked so hard to escape. The scars on her arms seemed to throb with phantom pain, and she found herself unconsciously adjusting her sleeves again, as if that simple gesture could somehow make the evidence of her previous life disappear. But scars, she'd learned, had a way of telling their stories whether you wanted them to or not. And some stories, once they started being told, couldn't be stopped. The second morning came with the same pre-dawn routine, but Sarah found herself listening more intently to the sounds of the awakening city outside her coffee shop. Every footstep on the sidewalk, every car engine starting, every distant siren carried a weight it hadn't possessed just 24 hours earlier. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through tactical assessments and threat evaluations like she was back in Afghanistan planning a convoy route through hostile territory. At exactly 0645, they returned. This time, Sarah was ready for them. She'd positioned herself behind the espresso machine where she could observe their entrance while maintaining the appearance of casual morning preparation. The tall one entered first, followed by his two companions in the same careful formation they'd used the previous day. But today, something was different. Today, they weren't just assessing the environment, they were studying her. "Morning," the tall one said, approaching the counter with what might have been a smile on a less weathered face. "Same as yesterday, if you don't mind?" "3 large blacks and breakfast bars," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "You guys work around here?" It was a fishing expedition, and from the way the big one's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly, they all knew it. But the tall one played along, leaning casually against the counter in a way that brought him close enough for quiet conversation. "Contract work. Security consulting. We're in town for a few weeks. Figured we'd found our morning spot." Security consulting. The euphemism was so transparent it was almost insulting, but Sarah appreciated the professional courtesy of maintaining plausible deniability. She poured their coffees with mechanical precision, hyper-aware of their continued observation. "Must keep you busy, security consulting around here." "San Diego's got its share of sensitive installations," said the smaller one from behind his companion. His voice carried a slight New England accent, crisp and precise. "Naval Base, MCRD, a couple other facilities that appreciate good security assessments." The mention of Marine Corps Recruit Depot was another breadcrumb, but Sarah filed it away without reaction. She'd learned long ago that information was currency in their world, and she wasn't ready to start spending hers yet. As she handed over their breakfast selection, the tall one's gaze dropped briefly to her hands. Sarah realized with a jolt of alarm that she'd unconsciously been gripping the coffee cup holder in the exact grip she'd been taught for controlling recoil during rapid-fire exercises. Her trigger finger was extended along the side of the holder, textbook weapons safety protocol applied to coffee service. Their eyes met across the counter, and Sarah saw the exact moment recognition clicked into place. Not recognition of her face, she was certain they'd never met before, but recognition of something deeper. The tall one's pupils dilated slightly, the same involuntary response she'd seen in fellow soldiers when they identified a potential threat or ally in civilian camouflage. "Interesting grip technique," he said quietly, so low that only she could hear over the background noise of the coffee shop. "Very precise." Sarah forced her hand to relax, switching to a normal civilian grip that felt awkward and inefficient after years of military conditioning. "Helps prevent spills. Clumsy hands." But even as she said it, she knew the lie wouldn't hold. Her hands moved with the kind of economy and precision that only came from extensive training, and anyone with similar background would spot it immediately. The way she maintained situational awareness while working, how her eyes continuously tracked the positions of everyone in the shop, even the way she kept her back to the wall while manning the counter, it all screamed military experience to anyone trained to look for it. The three men took their usual table, but today their conversation was different. Instead of the indistinct professional discussion she'd overheard yesterday, they spoke just loudly enough for her to catch fragments if she listened carefully. Words like deployment schedules and rotation cycles floated across the morning air, along with references to training exercises and equipment specifications that belonged firmly in the classified world she'd left behind. They were testing her, Sarah realized, dropping enough operational language to see if she'd react, watching for tells that would confirm their growing suspicions about her background. It was a sophisticated psychological assessment disguised as casual coffee shop conversation, and despite herself, she found a grudging professional respect for their technique. But she wasn't the same soldier who'd been deployed to Afghanistan 5 years ago. 3 years of civilian life had taught her patience in a way that military training never could. She served other customers with practiced efficiency, refilled coffee for the morning regulars, and maintained her carefully constructed cover identity without giving them the reaction they were fishing for. It was when she bent down to retrieve a dropped napkin that everything changed. The movement required her to crouch low behind the counter, a position that naturally caused her shirt to ride up and her sleeve to pull back. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds at most, a section of scarred flesh was visible that she'd kept hidden for 3 years of civilian life. The scarring started at her left wrist and traced up her forearm in a pattern that no civilian injury could explain. Burns from an IED explosion, partially healed shrapnel wounds, and the distinctive marks left by field surgery performed under combat conditions painted a story across her skin in white and pink tissue. But it was the small, precise scar just above her elbow that would be unmistakable to anyone with the right experience. The exact mark left by emergency arterial clamping, the kind of field medicine that only happened in active combat zones. When Sarah straightened up, she found the tall one standing at the counter, ostensibly returning for more cream, but positioned perfectly to have observed her momentary exposure. His face revealed nothing, but something in his posture had shifted. The casual assessment was gone, replaced by the kind of focused attention reserved for confirmed contacts. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a different quality now. Not quite military bearing, but close enough that Sarah's spine automatically straightened in response. "I was wondering if you might have a minute to chat when you're not busy. My name's Jake Morrison, by the way." The introduction was significant. Military personnel didn't share real names lightly, especially not with civilians they'd just met. By offering his name, Morrison was extending a level of professional courtesy that suggested he'd moved beyond suspicion into something approaching recognition. "Sarah Martinez," she replied, matching his tone without quite meaning to. "And I've got a few minutes now if you'd like." Morrison glanced back at his companions, some silent communication passing between them. The big one nodded almost imperceptibly, and the smaller one shifted position to maintain overwatch of the shop's entrance. Whatever this conversation was going to be, they were taking it seriously. "Mr. Morrison," she began, then paused. "Or should I say, Sergeant Martinez?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting them. 3 years of careful anonymity shattered in a single sentence, her military rank hanging in the air between them like an accusation. She felt her carefully maintained civilian persona beginning to crack, the warrior she'd been threatening to emerge despite all her efforts to bury that identity. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Morrison's expression softened slightly, moving from professional assessment towards something that might have been understanding. "Ma'am, with respect, those scars on your arm tell a pretty specific story. And the way you've been running tactical assessments on every customer who walks through that door suggests training that goes well beyond coffee service." Sarah felt the walls she'd built around her new life beginning to crumble. Part of her wanted to maintain the deception, to insist that he was mistaken, and send him away to preserve the quiet life she'd worked so hard to create. But another part, the part that had carried her through 15 years of military service, recognized the futility of maintaining a cover that had already been blown by people who knew exactly what to look for. "Sergeant First Class," she said quietly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. 3 deployments to Afghanistan. Medically retired 3 years ago. Morrison nodded, no surprise in his expression. "Command Sergeant Major Jake Morrison, Navy Special Warfare Development Group, currently on temporary assignment to Naval Special Warfare Command here in San Diego." He paused, letting the significance of his unit designation sink in. "My teammates and I noticed you yesterday, but it took us until this morning to be certain." Naval Special Warfare Development Group. SEAL Team 6 by any other name, though they'd never used that designation in public. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications hit her. These weren't just any military personnel who had wandered into her coffee shop. They were among the most elite special operations forces in the world, and somehow they'd made her former military despite 3 years of practicing civilian camouflage. "What gave me away?" she asked, professional curiosity overriding her alarm.
A lot of little things, but mainly you scan rooms like someone trained in close protection, and you maintain awareness like someone who's been in places where letting your guard down gets people killed. That's not something you learn in civilian life. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the morning rush, a steady stream of customers requiring Sarah's attention.
But as she served coffee and processed payments, she was acutely aware of Morrison returning to his table and the low-voiced discussion that followed among the three seals. She'd been made, her cover blown by professionals who knew exactly what to look for. The question now was what they planned to do with that information and whether the quiet life she'd built was about to disappear forever. As the morning crowd began to thin out, Sarah found herself facing a choice she'd hoped never to encounter. She could try to deflect, maintain her civilian identity, and hope they'd respect her obvious desire for privacy. Or she could acknowledge what they'd already figured out and deal with whatever consequences followed. The decision, she realized, might not be entirely hers to make. The lunch rush had ended, leaving the bell and grind in its typical afternoon lull. Sarah used the quiet time to deep clean the espresso machine, a task that usually helped calm her nerves, but today only provided a thin veneer over the anxiety churning in her chest. Morrison and his team had left after their morning revelation, but not before Morrison had quietly placed a business card on the counter with a simple message written on the back: "When you're ready to talk." She'd been staring at that card for the past 4 hours. Sarah knew she should throw it away, maintain her boundaries, and continue the civilian life she'd worked so hard to build. But something about Morrison's approach had been different from what she'd expected. There had been no pressure, no implied threats about maintaining operational security, or questions about classified information. Just recognition between professionals and an invitation to connect if she chose to. The afternoon was unusually warm for October in San Diego, and Sarah had propped open the front door to let in some fresh air. She was elbow deep in cleaning equipment when she heard the footsteps. Multiple sets, moving with the kind of precision that immediately put her on alert. But instead of Morrison's team, 5 men in dress blue uniforms entered the coffee shop. Marines, she realized immediately, noting the distinctive insignia and bearing that separated them from other military branches. They were young, probably fresh from some ceremony at MCRD, and carried themselves with the particular brand of confidence that came from surviving boot camp, but not yet being tested by real deployment. "Afternoon, ma'am," the apparent leader said as they approached the counter. He was tall and fresh-faced, with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that reminded Sarah painfully of some of the young soldiers she'd served with in Afghanistan. "We heard this was a good place for coffee." "Best in the neighborhood. What can I get you?" As she prepared their orders, a mix of complex coffee drinks that would have made her drill sergeants roll their eyes, Sarah found herself studying the Marines with the analytical eye she couldn't quite suppress. They were new. That much was obvious from their spotless uniforms and uncertain movements in civilian space. Probably their first time off base since arriving for training, still adjusting to the freedom of choosing their own coffee orders. "You serve a lot of military here?" the young leader asked as Sarah worked on their drinks. "Some," she replied carefully. "San Diego's a military town." "Yes, ma'am. We're here for advanced infantry training. Just finished up a ceremony this morning. Thought we'd celebrate with some real coffee instead of the stuff they serve in the chow hall." Sarah smiled despite herself. "Let me guess. Tastes like motor oil mixed with regret?" The Marines burst into laughter, the tension of formal ceremony finally breaking. "That's exactly right, ma'am. How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Sarah said, but the explanation seemed to satisfy their curiosity. As she handed over their drinks, one of the younger Marines, he couldn't have been more than 19, noticed her arm as her sleeve rode up slightly during the exchange. Unlike Morrison's trained observation, this was simple curiosity mixed with the kind of recognition that came from recent medical training. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be forward, but those look like combat injuries." The statement hung in the air like a challenge.
Sarah felt every eye in the coffee shop turn toward her, the afternoon quiet suddenly charged with tension. She could deflect, make some excuse about civilian accidents, and send them on their way. But looking at these young Marines, so eager, so untested, so certain that the world was divided into simple categories of right and wrong, she found herself making a different choice. "They are," she said simply. The admission seemed to electrify the group. The young Marine who'd spoken stepped closer to the counter, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. "Were you deployed, ma'am?" "3 times, Afghanistan." "Army?" "Sergeant First Class, 68W, combat medic, attached to Special Operations." The last part was stretching the truth slightly. She'd been attached to conventional infantry units that sometimes worked in support of special operations, but the distinction seemed less important than the impact her words had on the young Marines. Their entire demeanor shifted, casual customer interaction transforming into something approaching reverence. "Ma'am," the leader said, his voice carrying a formality that hadn't been there moments before, "it's an honor to meet you." Sarah felt uncomfortable under their scrutiny, but also strangely moved by their reaction. These young men were about to face the same challenges she had navigated, carry the same burdens she had borne, and potentially come home with the same invisible and visible scars she carried. In their eager faces, she saw echoes of the soldier she had once been, trained, competent, dangerous when necessary. "What's your MOS?" she asked the young leader, falling back on military terminology, despite herself. 0311, ma'am, rifleman. We're hoping to get selected for recon after we complete advanced training." Marine recon. Sarah's respect for their ambition was tempered with knowledge of what that path entailed. Marine recon Marines often found themselves in situations that closely paralleled her own combat medical experience. High-risk operations where split-second decisions meant the difference between bringing everyone home and writing letters to families. "That's a tough selection," she said. "What's driving you toward recon?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, as if no one had ever asked him to examine his motivations beyond generic patriotic responses. He was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking, while his teammates watched the exchange with obvious interest. "I want to make a difference, ma'am," he said finally. "Not just serve, but really contribute to something important. The instructors say recon Marines get assigned to the missions that matter most." Sarah nodded, recognizing the sentiment. She'd joined the Army with similar motivations, drawn to combat medicine because she wanted to be the person who brought people home alive. The idealism is admirable, but she also knew how quickly reality could complicate those simple desires. "Can I give you some advice?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Take care of each other out there. The mission matters, but your people matter more. And when you come home, because you will come home, don't try to carry everything alone. There's no shame in asking for help." The young Marine nodded seriously, but Sarah could see in his expression that he didn't really understand what she was telling him. How could he? He hadn't yet experienced the weight of making life and death decisions under fire, hadn't felt the responsibility of keeping other people's sons and daughters alive, hadn't learned that sometimes your best efforts weren't enough, and good people died anyway. "Ma'am," one of the other Marines spoke up, "what was it like? Deployment, I mean." The question was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. How could she explain the strange combination of crushing boredom and sheer terror that defined combat deployments? The way you could spend weeks doing routine patrols where nothing happened, then find yourself in a firefight where everything you'd trained for condensed into minutes of pure chaos. "Complicated," she said finally. "Nothing really prepares you for it, no matter how good your training is. But if you listen to your instructors, trust your teammates, and remember your training when things get difficult, you'll do fine." It was a sanitized version of the truth, edited for an audience that didn't need to hear about the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, and the way civilian life could feel like an alien planet after years of military structure. They'd learn those lessons soon enough, or hopefully never learn them at all. The Marines finished their coffee and prepared to leave, but the young leader lingered at the counter for a moment. "Ma'am, thank you for your service and for the advice. Thank you for yours. Stay safe out there." After they left, Sarah found herself standing alone behind the counter, emotionally drained by the encounter. In the span of 2 days, her carefully constructed civilian identity had been pierced, first by elite special operations personnel who recognized her tactical training, then by young Marines who saw her combat scars and treated her like a war hero. Both interactions had forced her to acknowledge parts of herself she'd been trying to suppress for 3 years. Morrison had seen the soldier she had been, trained, competent, dangerous when necessary. The young Marines had seen the veteran she had become, scarred, experienced, carrying wisdom earned through hard experience. But neither group had seen the person she was trying to become, someone who could serve coffee and live quietly without the weight of military service defining every interaction. As she closed up the shop that evening, Sarah found herself thinking about Morrison's business card, still sitting where she'd left it next to the register. Part of her wanted to maintain her isolation, to keep the past firmly in the past, where it couldn't complicate her present. But another part, the part that once took an oath to serve something larger than herself, wondered what opportunities might come from acknowledging the connections that military service created between people who'd shared similar experiences. The choice, she realized, was really about whether she wanted to continue hiding from who she'd been or start figuring out how to integrate that identity with who she was becoming. Tomorrow, she decided she would call Morrison, not because she was ready to return to military life, but because she was finally ready to stop running from it. The business card felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibilities she wasn't sure she was ready to explore. But for the first time in 3 years, the idea of having that conversation didn't fill her with dread.
It filled her with something that might have been hope. Sarah stared at Morrison's business card for 10 minutes before finally picking up her phone. The number seemed to burn itself into her memory as she dialed, each digit feeling like a step across a bridge she couldn't uncross. 3 rings, then a voice she recognized. "Morrison? Command Sergeant Major, this is Sarah Martinez from the coffee shop." A pause, then, "Miss Martinez, I was hoping you'd call. Are you free to talk?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah glanced around her empty apartment, taking in the sparse furnishings and deliberately impersonal decorations. She'd kept the space as neutral as possible, avoiding anything that might trigger memories of her previous life. No military memorabilia, no photos from deployment, no reminders of the woman she'd been before civilian life taught her to hide her scars. "I'm free," she said, "but I'm not sure what we're supposed to be talking about." Morrison's chuckle was warm, lacking the predatory edge she'd expected. "How about we start with coffee? Tomorrow morning, same time, but maybe we could sit down and have an actual conversation." The suggestion was reasonable, but Sarah felt her chest tighten with anxiety. Sitting down for a conversation implied a level of engagement she wasn't sure she was ready for, an acknowledgement that her cover was well and truly blown. "What kind of conversation?" asked she. "The kind where we treat each other like professionals instead of dancing around what we both already know," Morrison replied. "You served with distinction in a combat zone, from the look of those scars, under some pretty difficult circumstances. My team and I respect that service, and we're curious about your story. And if I don't want to share my story, then we drink coffee, exchange pleasantries about the weather, and go about our business. But Miss Martinez, with respect, you called me. That suggests you're ready for a different kind of conversation than we've been having." He was right, and they both knew it. Sarah had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of connection, declining invitations to veteran support groups, steering clear of military hangouts, carefully constructing a life that had no intersection with the world she'd left behind. But something about the past 2 days had shifted her perspective, forced her to confront the question of whether isolation was really healing or just another form of hiding. "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. "But we do this at the shop, during normal business hours. I'm not ready for anything more private than that." Copy that. And Ms. Martinez, thank you for making the call. After hanging up, Sarah found herself pacing the small confines of her apartment like a caged animal. She'd committed to something, though she wasn't entirely sure what. A conversation with Morrison could be anything from casual veteran networking to recruitment for some classified operation she wanted no part of. Special operations personnel didn't typically spend their time building casual friendships with retired medics, which meant they probably wanted something from her. The question was whether she was prepared to find out what that something might be. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by the familiar dreams that had been haunting her with increasing frequency. But this time, the nightmares took on a different quality. Instead of the usual replay of combat situations gone wrong, she found herself dreaming about the young Marines from yesterday, imagining them in situations where her medical training might have made the difference between life and death. She woke at 03:35, 2 hours before her usual time, drenched in sweat and heart racing from dreams where she'd been too far away to help when help was desperately needed. By 0500, she was at the shop, going through her morning routine with mechanical precision while her mind churned through tactical assessments and contingency planning. Morrison would arrive at 0645 with his team, same as the previous 2 days. They would order coffee, same as before. But then, instead of taking their usual table, Morrison would stay at the counter for a conversation that could change the trajectory of her carefully constructed civilian life. The morning regulars arrived on schedule, Mrs. Patterson with her romance novel and predictable order, the construction workers grabbing coffee before heading to job sites, and the night shift nurses transitioning from work to home. Sarah served them all with practiced efficiency while keeping one eye on the door, waiting for the arrival that would either validate her decision to call Morrison or confirm her fears about getting involved with active military personnel. At exactly 0645, they entered. But today, only Morrison approached the counter. His 2 teammates took their usual table, positioning themselves for overwatch, but clearly giving their team leader space for a private conversation. "Morning, Sarah," Morrison said, using her first name with a familiarity that suggested their phone call had shifted the parameters of their relationship. "The usual?" "Large black coffee," she confirmed, beginning the preparation process that would give her something to do with her hands during what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation. "Your team seems to trust you to handle this alone." "They do, but they're also here if this conversation goes somewhere that requires additional input." The implication was clear. Morrison was operating with the full knowledge and support of his team, which meant their interest in her was official rather than personal curiosity. Sarah felt her defensive instincts engaging, the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones beginning to color her assessment of the situation. "What kind of input?" she asked. Morrison accepted his coffee and leaned against the counter in a way that created a bubble of privacy around their conversation without appearing suspicious to other customers. The kind that comes from people who've worked in similar environments. "Sarah, can I be direct with you?" She nodded, appreciating the straightforward approach, even as it made her nervous. "My team and I are part of a training cadre that works with various military medical personnel who are transitioning to civilian support roles. We develop programs that help veterans leverage their military experience in ways that serve both their personal goals and ongoing national security interests." The explanation was carefully worded, probably rehearsed, but Sarah could read between the lines. They weren't just trainers, they were talent scouts, identifying veterans with specific skill sets who might be valuable for ongoing operations that require civilian cover. "And you think I might be interested in something like that?" she asked. "I think you're someone who served with distinction in a combat medical role, who clearly has advanced training beyond standard 68W qualifications, and who might be feeling somewhat isolated in civilian life." Morrison's assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Am I wrong about any of that? Sarah considered lying, maintaining the fiction that she was perfectly content with her new life serving coffee and avoiding anything connected to her military service. But something about Morrison's approach, direct, respectful, acknowledging her autonomy while making his case, made deception feel unnecessarily complicated. "You're not wrong," she admitted, "but I'm not sure I'm interested in anything that involves going back to that world, even in a support capacity."
What if I told you it wasn't about going back, but about moving forward, using your experience to help people who are facing the same challenges you've already overcome? The suggestion hit closer to home than Sarah was comfortable admitting. The young Marines from yesterday had stirred something in her, a sense of connection to people who are about to face trials she'd already survived, who could benefit from knowledge she'd gained through hard experience. "What kind of help?" she asked.
Morrison glanced around the coffee shop, confirming that they weren't being overheard, then continued in a lower voice. Combat medical training for special operations personnel. Specifically, training that incorporates real-world experience from recent deployments, the kind of training that can only be provided by someone who's actually performed field medicine under fire. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Combat medical training was something she could do in her sleep, muscle memory and hard-won knowledge that had saved dozens of lives during her deployments. But it was also the part of her military experience most directly connected to the trauma that had ended her career. That would mean working with active duty personnel, she said. It would. People who are preparing for deployment. People who need to know how to keep their teammates alive when the textbook solutions don't work. People like those Marines who were in here yesterday. Morrison's expression sharpened with interest. "You had Marines in here?" Sarah described the previous day's encounter, watching Morrison's face as she explained the young Marines' enthusiasm for recon selection and their obvious inexperience with real-world combat situations. "They're going to face situations they're not prepared for," she concluded. "Their medical training is probably adequate for routine injuries, but if they make it through recon selection and get deployed to hot zones, they're going to encounter trauma that requires more advanced techniques." "Exactly the kind of training gap we're trying to address," Morrison said. "Sarah, would you be willing to meet with our training coordinator? Just a conversation, no commitment. Find out what we're actually proposing before you make any decisions." The request was reasonable, but Sarah felt the familiar weight of a decision that could fundamentally alter her life trajectory. She'd worked so hard to build something stable and predictable, to create distance between herself and the chaos that had defined her military service. Getting involved with any kind of training program would mean opening herself back up to that world, with all the emotional and psychological risks that entailed. But she also couldn't ignore the appeal of using her experience to help people who were about to face the same challenges she'd survived. The young Marines had reminded her that her knowledge had value beyond her own healing process, that the hard-won expertise she'd gained through combat experience could serve a larger purpose than just her personal recovery. "When?" she asked. "This afternoon, if you're available. We're staying at a hotel about 10 minutes from here. Neutral ground, informal conversation, and you can leave anytime you want." Sarah looked around her coffee shop, taking in the familiar environment she'd created as a refuge from her past. For 3 years, this space had represented safety, predictability, and distance from anything that might trigger memories of combat. But now it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a hiding place, a carefully constructed barrier between who she'd been and who she might become. "I close at 3. I could meet after that." Morrison nodded, pulling out his phone to send a quick message. "I'll text you the address. And Sarah, thank you for being willing to listen." As Morrison rejoined his teammates and they left for whatever activities filled their day, Sarah found herself serving the rest of the morning rush with a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread. She'd committed to a conversation that could change everything, opening a door she'd kept firmly closed for 3 years. The question now was whether what lay beyond that door was an opportunity for growth or a path back to the trauma she'd worked so hard to escape. The Hampton Inn on Hotel Circle looked exactly like every other mid-range hotel Sarah had ever seen. Bland exterior, generic landscaping, and the kind of institutional aesthetic designed to be inoffensive to business travelers. She sat in her car for 5 minutes after arriving, studying the building and trying to convince herself that walking away was still an option. Morrison had texted her a room number on the 3rd floor, along with a message that his training coordinator was looking forward to meeting her. The phrasing suggested this was more than just Morrison's personal initiative, that her potential involvement in whatever program they were proposing had been discussed at higher levels of command. Sarah had changed clothes twice before leaving her apartment, ultimately settling on dark jeans and a long-sleeved shirt that covered her scars while still looking professional. She'd also done something she hadn't done in 3 years, packed her military medical bag in the trunk of her car. She wasn't sure why she'd brought it, but something about preparing for a conversation about combat medicine had triggered the old habits of always being ready to provide emergency care. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt interminable, each floor passing with mechanical precision while Sarah's mind raced through possible scenarios for the meeting ahead. Best case, they wanted her to consult on curriculum development for existing training programs, something she could do remotely without getting too deeply involved. Worst case, they were recruiting her for active deployment in some civilian contractor capacity, which she absolutely would not consider. Room 317 was at the end of a long hallway that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of military base housing. She knocked twice, the sound echoing in the empty corridor. Morrison opened the door, but he wasn't alone. Standing behind him was a woman in her early 40s with the kind of bearing that immediately identified her as senior military personnel. She was tall, athletic, with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that assessed Sarah with professional interest. "Sarah, this is Colonel Jennifer Reeves, our training coordinator," Morrison said, stepping aside to allow Sarah into the room. "Colonel, this is Sergeant Martinez." "Sergeant First Class Martinez," Colonel Reeves corrected, extending her hand for a firm shake. "It's an honor to meet you. Please, have a seat." The hotel room had been configured for a business meeting, with chairs arranged around a small table where several manila folders lay waiting. Sarah chose a seat that kept her back to the wall and maintained clear sightlines to both the door and the window, old habits that she noticed Colonel Reeves observing with approval. "Before we begin," Colonel Reeves said, settling into her own chair, "I want to be completely transparent about why we're here and what we're hoping to accomplish. Command Sergeant Major Morrison has briefed me on your background, but I'd like to hear your story directly from you." Sarah felt her defensive instincts engaging. "What kind of story are you looking for?" "The real one," Colonel Reeves replied. "Not the sanitized version from your personnel file, but what actually happened during your deployments, what you saw, what you learned, and why you left the service." The request for honesty was refreshing, but also terrifying. Sarah had spent 3 years avoiding detailed discussions of her deployment experiences, deflecting questions from well-meaning civilians, and even declining to participate in VA counseling programs that might have required her to revisit traumatic memories in detail. "That's a long story," she said. "We have time." Sarah looked between Morrison and Colonel Reeves, trying to assess their motivations and determine how much truth she was prepared to share. Both were watching her with the kind of patient attention that suggested this conversation was more important to them than they were letting on. "I deployed 3 times to Afghanistan between 2019 and 2022, attached to infantry units operating in Kandahar and Helmand provinces. Primary role was combat medical support, but I also provided training to Afghan National Army medics and assisted with humanitarian aid distribution." "That's the official version," Colonel Reeves observed. "What was the unofficial version?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. "Unofficially, I spent a lot of time in places where regular Army medics weren't supposed to be, doing things that weren't exactly covered in the field manual." "Such as?" "Emergency surgery and forward operating bases that weren't supposed to have surgical capability, training local medical personnel to perform procedures they weren't technically qualified for because they were the only medical support available in remote areas, providing medical care during operations that were classified above my clearance level." Colonel Reeves nodded, as if Sarah's admission confirmed something she'd already suspected. "And your final deployment?" This was the part Sarah had been dreading, the incident that had ended her military career and left her with both visible and invisible scars that still affected her daily life. She'd never spoken about it in detail to anyone, not to the military doctors who'd treated her physical injuries,
not to the counselors who'd processed her medical retirement, not even to herself during the long nights when nightmares forced her to relive those terrible minutes. My unit was providing medical support for a joint operation with Special Forces. We were attached to a convoy that was supposed to be routine transport, but intelligence was wrong about enemy activity in the area. Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing as she spoke, the familiar physiological responses to trauma beginning to manifest. IED followed by sustained small arms fire. Multiple casualties, including the Special Forces medic who was supposed to be primary medical support. "So you took over," Morrison said, his voice carrying the understanding of someone who'd been in similar situations. "I took over," Sarah confirmed. "Performed surgery in the back of an MRAP under fire, managed triage for 8 wounded personnel, and kept everyone alive until we could get to a proper medical facility. But the IED had done damage to my left arm, and I was working with significant blood loss for most of the engagement." "How long?" 4 hours, from initial contact until we reached the forward surgical team. The numbers were stark, but they didn't capture the reality of working with damaged equipment, limited supplies, and her own injuries while enemy fire continued around the vehicle. They didn't describe the weight of making decisions about who to treat first when multiple people needed immediate attention, or the way that her hands had shaken from blood loss while she tried to maintain steady pressure on arterial wounds. Everyone made it. All 8 casualties survived and were eventually transported back to the States for continued treatment. But I lost function in my left hand for 6 months, and the psychological impact of the incident was deemed incompatible with continued deployment. Colonel Reeves opened one of the manila folders and consulted what appeared to be medical records. "Your treating physician noted that you displayed symptoms consistent with acute stress reaction, but that you continued performing medical duties until all casualties were stabilized." "I did my job," Sarah said simply. "You did more than your job," Morrison interjected. "According to the after-action report, 2 of those casualties wouldn't have survived without immediate surgical intervention that you performed under conditions that would challenge experienced surgeons in controlled environments." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I had training and they needed help. It wasn't complicated. "It was extraordinary," Colonel Reeves said firmly. "And it's exactly the kind of real-world experience that our current training programs can't replicate. We can teach procedures and protocols, but we can't teach the kind of decision-making under pressure that you demonstrated during that incident." "What are you asking me to do?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. Colonel Reeves closed the folder and leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "We're asking you to help us train the next generation of combat medics and special operations personnel, not just teaching procedures, but sharing the kind of tactical medical knowledge that can only come from real experience." "Training people for deployment," Sarah said. "Training people to save lives," Morrison corrected. "People who are going to face the same situations you survived, who need to know how to make the same decisions that you made." The proposition was both appealing and terrifying. Sarah could see the value in sharing her experience in potentially helping other medical personnel avoid the mistakes that cost lives in combat zones. But she could also see how easily involvement in such a program could drag her back into the world she had worked so hard to escape. "What would that look like practically?" she asked. "Initially, consulting on curriculum development for advanced combat medical training, reviewing existing protocols, identifying gaps based on your deployment experience, and helping us design scenarios that better reflect real-world conditions. And long-term? If you're interested and the initial consulting goes well, we'd like you to consider a more hands-on role, direct instruction for special operations medical personnel, scenario-based training that incorporates your experience with high-stress emergency care." Sarah felt the familiar weight of a decision that could alter the entire trajectory of her life. For 3 years, she'd avoided anything that might reconnect her with her military experience, focusing instead on building a quiet civilian existence that kept the trauma of her final deployment at arm's length.
But the past few days had forced her to confront the question of whether hiding from her experience was really healing, or just another form of imprisonment. The young Marines she'd met, Morrison's team, even her own restless dissatisfaction with the limitations of her current life. All of it pointed toward the possibility that her military experience wasn't just a source of trauma, but also a valuable resource that could serve a purpose beyond her own recovery. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Colonel Reeves replied. "This isn't a decision to make lightly. Take whatever time you need." As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to leave, Morrison walked her to the door. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "When you were treating those casualties under fire, what kept you going? What made it possible to function when everything was falling apart?" The question caught her off guard, forcing her to examine motivations she'd never really analyzed. "I knew they were counting on me," she said after a moment. "Someone had to keep them alive, and I was the only one there who could do it." Morrison smiled. "That's exactly why we need you for this program. That sense of responsibility, that willingness to step up when people need help, it's not something we can teach. But we can create opportunities for people who have it to share that knowledge with others." As Sarah drove home through the gathering dusk of San Diego evening, she found herself thinking about the young Marines who'd visited her coffee shop, about the enthusiasm in their faces when they talked about wanting to make a difference. She thought about Morrison's team, clearly experienced operators who still recognized the value of learning from someone who'd faced challenges they might encounter. But mostly, she thought about the 8 casualties she'd kept alive during 4 hours of hell in Afghanistan, and the possibility that sharing her experience might help other medics do the same for their people when the time came. The decision, she realized, wasn't really about whether she was ready to return to military life. It was about whether she was ready to use her experience to help ensure that fewer people would have to face the same challenges she'd survived alone. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah knew what her answer would be. The only question was whether she had the courage to follow through with it. Sarah spent the night walking. She left her apartment at 2200 hours and found herself wandering the quiet streets of San Diego, moving through neighborhoods she'd never explored during her 3 years of civilian life. The city felt different in the darkness, less overwhelming, more manageable, with enough activity to feel safe, but not so much that she felt exposed. She'd always done her best thinking while moving, a habit developed during countless patrol missions where walking and thinking had been survival necessities. Tonight, she needed to work through the implications of Colonel Reeves's offer and determine whether she was ready to step back into the world she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The waterfront near Seaport Village was nearly empty at this hour, just a few late-night joggers and the occasional security patrol. Sarah found a bench overlooking the harbor and watched the lights of naval vessels anchored in the bay, their presence a constant reminder that San Diego was fundamentally a military town, no matter how much she'd tried to ignore that reality. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Morrison. Hope the meeting was helpful. No pressure on timing for your decision. The message was considerate, but it also reminded her that people were waiting for her answer. Not just Morrison and Colonel Reeves, but the future trainees who might benefit from her experience, the young medics who would face combat situations without the knowledge she'd gained through hard experience. Sarah pulled up the contact information for her former commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, who'd overseen her medical discharge 3 years ago. They'd maintained sporadic contact since her retirement, mostly brief updates on her transition to civilian life. But Chen had always made it clear that he considered her early departure from military service a significant loss for the Army medical community. She stared at his number for 10 minutes before finally pressing call. West Coast time meant it was after midnight, but Chen had always been a night owl, and military officers were accustomed to odd-hour communications. Sarah? Chen's voice carried surprise and what might have been concern. Everything all right?
I'm fine, sir. Sorry to call so late, but I needed to run something by you. What's on your mind? Sarah described her encounter with Morrison's team and the subsequent meeting with Colonel Reeves, leaving out specific details but conveying the general nature of their proposal. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the scope and structure of the potential training program. So, they want you to consult on combat medical training for special operations personnel, he summarized when she finished. What's your gut reaction? Conflicted, Sarah admitted. Part of me sees the value in sharing experience that could help people perform better in situations I've already survived, but part of me is terrified of getting pulled back into that world. Because of the psychological impact? Because I worked so hard to build something separate from all of that. Because I'm afraid that getting involved with active military training will undo the progress I've made in civilian life. Chen was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could imagine him weighing his words carefully. Sarah, can I be direct with you? Yes, sir. In the 3 years since your discharge, every time we've talked, you've sounded like someone who is still fighting a war. Not against external enemies, but against yourself. Like you were so focused on avoiding anything that might trigger difficult memories that you weren't actually living. The assessment was uncomfortable, but Sarah couldn't deny its accuracy. I've been working on finding stability. You've been working on hiding, Chen corrected, not unkindly, which was probably necessary for a while, but the question is whether it's still serving you or holding you back. What do you mean? I mean that your combat medical experience represents some of the most advanced trauma care performed under fire in the past decade. That knowledge is valuable, not just for your own healing, but for the people who might benefit from learning it. Maybe the question isn't whether you're ready to go back to military life, but whether you're ready to stop running from the part of your military life that actually mattered. The observation hit close to home. Sarah had been so focused on avoiding triggers and maintaining emotional distance from her service that she'd also disconnected from the aspects of military medicine that had given her life meaning and purpose. The 8 casualties she'd kept alive during her final deployment, she thought about the terror and determination she'd felt while working to stabilize their injuries under impossible conditions. But she also remembered the satisfaction of seeing them recover, of knowing that her training and experience had made the difference between life and death for people who had families waiting for them to come home. That sense of meaningful contribution had been absent in her civilian life, replaced by the safe but ultimately empty routine of serving coffee to people who saw her no more than a friendly barista. She'd traded purpose for peace, and while the peace had been necessary for her recovery, she was beginning to question whether it was enough for her long-term fulfillment. Her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize, with a local area code. Hello? Miss Martinez, this is Corporal Jennifer Walsh. I was one of the Marines who came into your coffee shop yesterday. Sarah recognized the voice, one of the Marines who'd been with the group seeking advanced training for recon selection. Corporal Walsh, what can I do for you? Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the coffee shop's website. I wanted to thank you for the advice you gave us yesterday and to ask you something. Go ahead. A couple of us have been talking since yesterday about what you said about taking care of each other and not trying to carry everything alone. We realized that our medical training probably isn't as comprehensive as it should be for the kind of missions we're hoping to get selected for. Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation, sensing where this conversation might be heading. We were wondering, Corporal Walsh continued, if you might be willing to give us some additional training, unofficial, just on weekends or whenever you have time. We know you have real-world experience that we could benefit from. The request was exactly the kind of engagement Sarah had been avoiding, but it also represented an opportunity to directly impact the preparation of people who were about to face the same challenges she'd survived. What kind of training are you looking for? She asked. Advanced trauma care, field surgery techniques, triage under pressure, the kind of things they can't really teach us in classroom settings. We're willing to pay for your time, and we understand if you're not interested. Sarah closed her eyes. feeling the weight of multiple decisions converging into a single moment of choice. Colonel Reeves's offer, Chen's assessment of her civilian life, and now this direct request from young Marines who recognized they needed knowledge she possessed. Corporal Walsh, let me ask you something. How serious are you and your teammates about this additional training? Very serious, ma'am. We've all seen enough deployment footage and talked to enough experienced Marines to know that the difference between good medical care and great medical care is often the difference between bringing people home alive or writing letters to their families. The response demonstrated exactly the kind of understanding and motivation that Sarah would want to see in potential trainees. These weren't Marines looking for entertainment or trying to satisfy curiosity about combat medicine. They were people who understood the stakes and wanted to be as prepared as possible to save lives when it mattered. I'll tell you what, Sarah said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Give me a week to work out some logistics, and then we'll talk about setting up a training program. But if we do this, we do it right. Proper equipment, realistic scenarios, and no cutting corners on safety protocols. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. We really appreciate this opportunity. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the park until dawn, watching the city wake up around her and feeling something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Excitement about the future, not the anxious anticipation of avoiding problems or the relief of maintaining stability, but genuine enthusiasm about using her experience to help people prepare for challenges she understood better than most. When she finally returned to her apartment, Sarah drafted 2 messages. The first was to Colonel Reeves, accepting the consulting position with the understanding that she would start with curriculum development and evaluate the possibility of direct instruction based on how the initial phase progressed. The second was to Morrison, requesting a meeting to discuss how her civilian consulting work might coordinate with any training she provided to the young Marines who had contacted her. As she prepared for another day at the coffee shop, Sarah realized that her carefully maintained separation between her military past and civilian present was about to become much more complicated. But for the first time since her medical discharge, that complication felt like an opportunity, not a threat. The woman who walked into the Bell and Grind that morning was still Sarah Martinez, coffee shop owner and former combat medic. But she was also, once again, someone who was ready to use her hardest-won knowledge to help other people survive the challenges she'd already faced. The transformation wasn't complete. There would be difficult conversations ahead, moments of doubt, and the constant challenge of balancing her own emotional well-being with her commitment to helping others. But as she unlocked the front door and began her morning routine, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten. A sense of purpose that extended beyond her own recovery and into the possibility of making a meaningful difference in other people's lives. The coffee shop was still her sanctuary, but it was no longer her hiding place.
It was becoming the foundation for something larger, a bridge between the person she'd been and the person she was ready to become.
2 weeks after accepting Colonel Reeves' consulting position, Sarah found herself standing in a military training facility at Camp Pendleton, surrounded by equipment she hadn't seen since her discharge 3 years ago. The medical simulation lab was state-of-the-art, filled with computerized mannequins capable of simulating complex trauma scenarios, but Sarah could immediately identify gaps between the training environment and the reality of combat medicine. "The scenarios are too clean," she told Morrison, who was observing her initial assessment of the facility. "Real combat medical situations don't happen in sterile environments with perfect lighting and all the equipment you need within arm's reach." Morrison nodded, making notes on a tablet as Sarah moved through the lab space. "That's exactly what Colonel Reeves hoped you'd identify. What would you recommend to make the training more realistic?" Sarah studied the setup carefully, her mind automatically cataloging modifications that would better reflect the conditions she'd worked under during deployment. Environmental stressors, for starters, noise, limited lighting, equipment failures. And the scenarios need to include resource constraints, having to make do with limited supplies while treating multiple casualties. Can you design training scenarios that incorporate those elements? I can design scenarios that will prepare people for situations they hope they never encounter, Sarah replied. The question is whether the trainees are ready for that level of realism. The facility tour was part of Sarah's initial consultation phase, during which she was reviewing existing training protocols and identifying areas for improvement. So far, the work had been intellectually engaging without being emotionally overwhelming, analyzing problems and proposing solutions without having to relive her own combat experiences in detail. But she knew that would change when she moved into the direct instruction phase. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Morrison said as they concluded the facility tour. "We've had some requests from other branches for access to your training programs. Apparently, word has gotten out about the consulting work you're doing with us." Sarah felt a flutter of concern. What kind of requests? Air Force Pararescue, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon. They're all interested in advanced combat medical training that incorporates real-world deployment experience. The scope of interest was both flattering and intimidating. Sarah had expected to work with a small group of Navy personnel, but the prospect of training special operations medics from multiple branches suggested a level of responsibility she wasn't sure she was prepared for. "That's a lot of people," she said. "It is, but it's also an opportunity to make a significant impact on combat medical readiness across the entire special operations community." As they drove back towards San Diego, Sarah found herself thinking about the expanding scope of her new role. What had started as curriculum consulting was evolving into something that could affect the training of hundreds of special operations personnel, each of whom might eventually find themselves in situations where the knowledge she shared could mean the difference between life and death. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also energizing in a way that civilian life had never been. Back at the coffee shop that afternoon, Sarah was reviewing training protocols when Corporal Walsh and 3 other Marines entered, looking noticeably different from their previous visit. Instead of dress uniforms, they wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with the increased confidence that came from successfully completing advanced training phases. "Miss Martinez," Walsh said, approaching the counter with a grin, "we have good news." "Let me guess, you made it through another phase of selection." "We did. All 4 of us are moving forward to the final selection phase for recon training, and we wanted to thank you for the additional medical training we've been doing on weekends." Over the past 2 weeks, Sarah had been meeting with the young Marines every Saturday morning in the back room of her coffee shop, using medical training supplies she'd purchased with her consulting fee to provide hands-on instruction in advanced trauma care. The training sessions had been informal but intensive, covering techniques that weren't typically taught until much later in military medical education. "How's the training been working out?" Sarah asked. "It's been incredible," one of the other Marines replied. "Last week, during our selection phase, we had a medical emergency simulation that probably would have stumped us before your training. But because you'd taught us about prioritizing airway management and multi-casualty scenarios, we knew exactly what to do." The feedback was gratifying, but it also highlighted something Sarah had been grappling with throughout her consulting work: the disconnect between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Teaching procedures in a controlled environment is valuable, but it can't fully replicate the stress and chaos of real combat medical situations. "I'm glad the training is helping, but remember that simulations are still just practice. The real thing will be different." "We know, ma'am, but having the foundation you've given us makes us feel more confident about handling whatever we encounter." After the Marines left, Sarah found herself reflecting on the strange dual existence she'd developed over the past month. During business hours, she was still the friendly coffee shop owner who served regulars and maintained the peaceful routine she'd built over 3 years. But increasingly, her evenings and weekends were filled with military training activities that connected her directly to the world she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The duality was manageable so far, but Sarah could sense that it wouldn't be sustainable indefinitely.
At some point, she would need to choose between maintaining her civilian sanctuary and fully embracing the military training role that was rapidly expanding beyond her original expectations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Reeves. "Sarah, we've had a request from SOCOM for you to brief senior leadership on combat medical training gaps. Would you be available for a meeting at MacDill AFB next week?" Special Operations Command, the highest levels of military special operations leadership, requesting her input on training protocols that would affect thousands of personnel across all branches of service. 3 months ago, Sarah was hiding her military background from customers in her coffee shop. Now she was being asked to advise the people who determine training standards for the most elite military units in the world. The transformation was happening faster than she had anticipated, and with more far-reaching implications than she had ever imagined when she first called Morrison's number. She typed back, "I'm available. What's the scope of the briefing?" Comprehensive assessment of current combat medical training protocols, with recommendations for incorporating real-world deployment experience. They want your analysis of training gaps and proposed solutions for addressing them across all SOF branches. Sarah stared at the message, feeling the weight of the responsibility being offered to her. This wasn't just consulting on curriculum development anymore. This was the opportunity to influence combat medical training at the highest levels of military command, to help shape the preparation that thousands of special operations personnel would receive before deploying to hostile environments. It was also a level of engagement with the military establishment that would make it impossible to maintain her carefully constructed distance from her service background. She walked to the window of her coffee shop and looked out at the street scene she'd watched every day for 3 years. The same pedestrians following the same routines, the same traffic patterns, the same peaceful predictability that had helped her heal from the trauma of combat. But now that scene felt constraining rather than comforting, a reminder of how small her world had become in her effort to avoid anything that might trigger difficult memories. The young Marines who'd visited that afternoon were preparing to put their lives on the line in service of their country, facing challenges that Sarah understood better than most people alive. She had knowledge that could help them survive those challenges, experience that could be translated into training that might save lives when it mattered most. But accessing that knowledge would require her to stop hiding from her past and start using it as a resource for helping others. Sarah typed her response to Colonel Reeves. "I'll take the briefing. Send me the details." As she hit send, Sarah realized she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The quiet coffee shop owner who'd spent 3 years avoiding her military past was about to walk into the Pentagon and advise the nation's most senior special operations leadership on combat medical training. The woman who entered the bell and grind that morning had been Sarah Martinez, former soldier turned civilian entrepreneur. The woman who would board a plane to Florida next week would be Sergeant First Class Sarah Martinez, combat veteran and subject matter expert on battlefield medicine. The transformation was happening faster than she had anticipated and with more far-reaching implications than she had ever imagined when she first called Morrison's number.
MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida was a world away from the quiet coffee shop in San Diego. But as Sarah walked through the security checkpoints and into the Special Operations Command headquarters, she felt muscle memory taking over. The institutional green corridors, the crisp salutes, the sense of purposeful urgency that permeated every military installation, it all felt simultaneously foreign and familiar after 3 years of civilian life. Colonel Reeves met her at the Visitor Processing Center, looking every inch the senior military officer in her dress uniform, complete with an impressive array of ribbons and decorations. Sarah had opted for a conservative business suit, professional but clearly civilian, a visual reminder to herself that she was here as a consultant rather than returning to military service. "Sarah, thank you for making the trip," Colonel Reeves said as they walked toward the briefing room. "I should warn you that the audience today includes some very senior people who aren't used to being told their training programs have significant gaps. Are you suggesting I should soften my assessment?" I'm suggesting you be prepared for pushback and that you have concrete data to support your recommendations. The briefing room was impressive, a modern amphitheater with tiered seating arranged around a central presentation area, equipped with multiple screens and sophisticated audio-visual equipment. As Sarah set up her materials, she watched the audience filing in. Colonels and generals from multiple branches, senior enlisted personnel with decades of experience, and civilian contractors who specialized in military training development. At exactly 1400 hours, a 2-star general entered the room, bringing everyone to attention. General Patricia Morrison, no relation to Command Sergeant Major Morrison, despite the shared name, was the Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command, with a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense and demanding practical solutions to operational problems. Ladies and gentlemen, General Morrison began without preamble, we're here today to discuss potential improvements to our combat medical training protocols. Sergeant First Class Martinez has been consulting with various SOF units on this topic, and her initial assessments suggest we have some significant gaps to address. The introduction was straightforward, but I could feel the skepticism in the room. She was a former enlisted soldier, addressing senior officers and experienced training professionals, claiming that programs they'd developed and refined over decades needed fundamental revision. Sergeant Martinez, General Morrison continued, the floor is yours. Sarah activated the first slide of her presentation, displaying a stark statistic. In the past 5 years, 23% of combat fatalities in special operations units were classified as potentially preventable with improved field medical care. That represents 47 lives that might have been saved with better training. The room was completely silent. Sarah let the number hang in the air for a moment before continuing. My assessment of current training protocols identifies 3 critical gaps that contribute to this preventable mortality rate. First, training scenarios don't adequately replicate the environmental stressors of actual combat medical situations. Second, current protocols assume availability of equipment and supplies that may not be accessible in real-world situations. Third, training focuses on individual procedures rather than integrated decision-making under extreme time pressure. She clicked to the next slide, showing photographs from her own deployment experience, with faces blurred for operational security, but showing the actual conditions where combat medicine was performed. This is medical care performed in the back of an MRAP during active enemy contact, she explained, pointing to an image that showed the cramped, chaotic environment where she'd performed emergency surgery. Limited lighting, constant movement, equipment scattered by blast effects, and the added stress of ongoing combat operations. None of these conditions are replicated in current training scenarios. A colonel in the front row raised his hand. Sergeant Martinez, while we appreciate your deployment experience, our training scenarios are based on extensive research and input from numerous subject matter experts. Are you suggesting that all of that expertise is flawed? Sarah had been expecting this type of challenge. Sir, I'm suggesting that expertise based on controlled environments and theoretical scenarios, while valuable, is incomplete without input from personnel who've performed these procedures under actual combat conditions. The research is solid, but it's missing the real-world variables that can make the difference between successful treatment and preventable casualties. She clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed breakdown of her own medical actions during the incident that had ended her military career. During a 4-hour firefight in Helmand Province, I treated 8 casualties with varying degrees of trauma, including 3 who required immediate surgical intervention. The medical equipment available was limited to what could be carried in a combat load, lighting was provided by flashlights and vehicle headlights, and all treatment was performed while under intermittent small arms fire. The room was listening intently now, the skepticism replaced with professional interest. The procedures I performed weren't particularly advanced: chest tubes, arterial repairs, and emergency tracheotomy, all things that are covered in current training programs. But the decision-making process, the resource management, and the environmental adaptation required to perform those procedures successfully under those conditions, none of that is adequately addressed in existing training. General Morrison leaned forward. What specific changes are you recommending? 3 primary modifications, Sarah replied, advancing to her recommendation slide. First,
environmental realism in training scenarios, reduced lighting, background noise, equipment failures, and time pressure that actually replicates combat conditions. Second, resource constraint training that forces medics to make do with limited supplies and improvised equipment. Third, integrated scenario training that combines medical procedures with tactical decision-making and stress inoculation. She paused, looking around the room to gauge reception before delivering her most controversial recommendation. I'm also recommending that all advanced combat medical training include direct instruction from personnel who've performed these procedures under actual combat conditions, not just consultation on curriculum development, but hands-on training from people who've been there.
The silence that followed was heavy with implication. What Sarah was suggesting wasn't just curriculum modification. It was a fundamental change in how the military approached combat medical training, requiring the integration of combat veterans into formal training programs in ways that hadn't been done before. Sergeant Martinez, another colonel, asked, "Do you have data supporting the effectiveness of these modifications?" Sarah smiled, knowing this question would come. "I do. Over the past month, I've been providing supplemental training to a group of Marine recon candidates using these modified approaches. Their performance on medical simulation tests improved by an average of 34% compared to control groups, and their confidence ratings for handling complex trauma scenarios increased by 58%. The numbers were impressive, but Sarah knew they represented only a small sample size. Still, they demonstrated proof of concept for her training modifications. Additionally, preliminary feedback from Navy SEAL teams that have participated in modified training scenarios suggests significantly improved performance in medical emergency simulations. General Morrison consulted her notes, then looked up. "Sergeant Martinez, assuming we were to implement some version of these recommendations, would you be willing to participate in the development and implementation process?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that her answer would determine not just the direction of her consulting work, but the entire trajectory of her post-military life. "Yes, ma'am. I believe this work is important enough to warrant my full commitment. Even if it required extended travel, integration with active military training programs, and significant time away from your civilian business?" Sarah thought about her coffee shop, the peaceful routine she'd built, the careful distance she'd maintained from anything that might trigger memories of combat. Then she thought about the young Marines who'd sought her training, the statistics showing preventable combat deaths, and the opportunity to potentially save lives through improved preparation. "Yes, ma'am. The coffee shop can be managed by someone else. This work is more important." General Morrison nodded slowly. "Very well. Colonel Reeves, I want you to work with Sergeant Martinez to develop a comprehensive implementation plan for these training modifications. Timeline for initial rollout is 6 months, with full implementation across all SOF medical training within 18 months. The briefing concluded with detailed discussions of logistics, budget requirements, and coordination between different training commands. As the room emptied, Sarah found herself standing at the presentation podium, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She'd walked into the room as a consultant offering suggestions for training improvements. She was walking out as the architect of a comprehensive overhaul of special operations medical training with responsibility for implementing changes that would affect thousands of personnel across all branches of service. Colonel Reeves approached as Sarah packed up her materials. "How are you feeling about all this?" "Overwhelmed," I admitted. 3 months ago, I was hiding my military background from coffee shop customers. Now I'm redesigning training for the entire special operations community. Are you having second thoughts?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The scope of responsibility was daunting, and she knew the work ahead would be demanding in ways that would challenge her emotional recovery and force her to engage more deeply with her combat experience than she'd done since her discharge. But she knew that the work was important, that her experience could help prepare other people to save lives in situations she understood better than almost anyone. "No second thoughts," she said. "Just recognition that my life is about to change in ways I never anticipated."
As she flew back to San Diego that evening, she looked down at the lights of American cities passing below and reflected on the journey that had brought her from a wounded combat medic hiding behind a coffee counter to a subject matter expert advising the highest levels of military command. The transformation wasn't complete. There would be months of challenging work ahead, difficult conversations about traumatic experiences, and the constant balance between using her past to help others while protecting her own emotional well-being. But for the first time since her medical discharge, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something meaningful rather than running away from something painful. The work would be hard, but it would also be important in ways that serving coffee, however peacefully, could never be. She was ready to stop hiding from her past and start using it to help shape the future.
6 months after the briefing at MacDill, Sarah stood in a modified training facility at Camp Pendleton, watching a group of Navy SEALs work through a combat medical scenario she'd designed. The environment was deliberately chaotic. Strobing lights to simulate muzzle flashes, loud audio tracks of gunfire and explosions, and equipment scattered around the training area to replicate the disorder of actual combat zones. The scenario itself was based directly on her own experience during her final deployment. Multiple casualties with varying degrees of trauma, limited medical supplies, and the requirement to perform emergency procedures while under simulated enemy fire. But unlike her real experience, these trainees had the benefit of preparation specifically designed to prepare them for exactly these conditions. "Time," she called, ending the exercise. The SEALs immediately stopped their medical procedures and stepped back from the training mannequins, breathing hard from the combination of physical exertion and psychological stress. "Debrief in 5 minutes," Sarah announced. "Think about what went well, what could have been better, and what you learned about performing under pressure." As the trainees took a break to hydrate and collect their thoughts, Morrison approached from his observation position. He'd been present for most of Sarah's training sessions over the past months, both as a liaison with command and as someone who understood the value of what she was teaching. "How do you think they did?" he asked. "Better than I did during my first real experience with that situation," Sarah replied honestly. "They're making decisions based on training rather than improvising under pressure. That's exactly what we wanted to achieve." The training program Sarah had developed over the past 6 months was comprehensive and demanding. It combined realistic environmental stressors with progressive skill development, starting with basic procedures performed under ideal conditions and gradually adding complexity until trainees could perform advanced trauma care in situations that closely replicated actual combat scenarios. But the most important component, Sarah had learned, wasn't the technical training, it was the stress inoculation that helped personnel maintain clear thinking and effective decision-making when everything around them was falling apart. "Ready for debrief?" she asked the group. The SEALs gathered in a circle, still wearing their training gear, but now focused on analysis and learning rather than performing under pressure. Sarah had learned that the debrief session was often more valuable than the exercise itself, providing opportunities for trainees to process their experience and identify lessons that would stick with them during real emergencies. "Who wants to start?" she asked. "What was the most challenging aspect of that scenario?" "Resource management," one of the SEALs replied immediately. "Having to decide which supplies to use for which casualties, knowing that using too much on one patient might mean not having enough for someone else." Sarah nodded. "That's the reality of combat medicine. You rarely have everything you need, so you have to make choices about how to allocate limited resources for maximum effect." "How did you make those decisions?" "Triage protocols, but adapted for what we actually had available rather than what the textbook assumes we'd have." Exactly. Textbook triage assumes ideal conditions and unlimited supplies. Real-world triage means making the best decisions possible with what you actually have to work with. The discussion continued for 30 minutes, with each trainee contributing observations about their performance and lessons learned from the exercise. Sarah found these sessions as valuable as formal instruction because they helped trainees develop the analytical thinking that would serve them well when facing novel situations in the field. As the group dispersed,
One of the younger SEALs approached Sarah privately. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you deal with the pressure of knowing that people's lives depend on the decisions you make?" During that exercise, even knowing it was just training, I felt the weight of responsibility for keeping those casualties alive. The question was one Sarah had been asked frequently during her months of training instruction, and she'd developed a standard response about focus, preparation, and trusting your training. But looking at this young operator, probably barely out of his teens, preparing to deploy to situations where he might face the same challenges she'd survived, she decided to give him the honest answer instead. You never really get comfortable with that pressure. The day you stop feeling the weight of that responsibility is the day you should stop doing this job. But you learn to channel that pressure into focus, to use it as motivation to be as prepared as possible and to perform at your best when it matters most. The SEAL nodded thoughtfully. "Did you feel prepared during your deployment experiences?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I felt as prepared as training could make me. But real situations always have variables that training can't anticipate. The key is being prepared enough and confident enough in your basic skills that you can adapt when you encounter something you haven't seen before." Is that what happened during the incident that ended your career? The question was more personal than Sarah usually addressed during training sessions, but something about the young operator's genuine concern made her willing to share more than her standard, sanitized version. "I was prepared for the medical procedures I had to perform, but I wasn't prepared for the psychological impact of being responsible for 8 lives while I was bleeding out myself. The technical training got everyone home alive, but the emotional aftermath took me 3 years to process." "How did you process it?" She gestured towards the training facility around them. "This, actually. Realizing that my experience had value beyond my own healing, that I could use what I'd learned to help other people be better prepared than I was." As the young SEAL left, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much had changed since she'd first encountered Morrison's team in her coffee shop. The woman who had been hiding her scars and avoiding any connection to her military service had become someone who shared her most difficult experiences as teaching tools for the next generation of combat medics. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights when preparing training scenarios had triggered nightmares. Sessions where discussing her deployment experiences had left her emotionally drained for days. And moments when she'd questioned whether exposing herself to these psychological challenges was worth the potential benefit to her trainees. But there had also been letters from deployed personnel who had used her training to save lives in real combat situations. Feedback from commanders reporting improved medical performance in their units, and the satisfaction of knowing that her hardest-won knowledge was helping other people survive challenges she understood intimately. Colonel Reeves approached as Sarah finished cleaning up the training area. "Sarah, we've got the metrics back from the first units that deployed after completing your training program. And preventable mortality rates in special operations units are down 31% compared to the same period last year. Medical performance ratings from unit commanders are up across the board, and we're getting requests from conventional forces asking when they can access similar training." The statistics were gratifying, but Sarah knew they represented more than just improved training outcomes. Each percentage point represented lives saved, families that wouldn't receive tragic notifications, and young service members who would come home intact instead of wounded or worse. "What about expanding to conventional forces?" Sarah asked. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. TRADOC wants to incorporate your training methods into the standard curriculum for all Army medics. It would require you to work with training development teams across multiple installations, probably mean relocating to the East Coast for extended periods." TRADOC, the organization responsible for developing training standards for the entire Army medical community. What Colonel Reeves was describing wasn't just expansion of Sarah's current work. It was the opportunity to influence the preparation of thousands of combat medics who would serve in units across the globe. "That's a significant commitment," Sarah said. "It is, but it's also the chance to make your training methods the standard for all Army medical personnel, not just special operations. Think about the impact that could have." Sarah looked around the training facility where she'd spent the past 6 months, taking in the equipment and modifications that had been developed specifically to implement her training methods. Everything here represented the evolution from her initial consulting work to a comprehensive approach to combat medical training that was already saving lives. But expanding to conventional forces would mean leaving behind the relatively small, elite community she'd been working with and taking on responsibility for training programs that would affect tens of thousands of personnel. "I need to think about it," Sarah said. "Of course. But Sarah, I want you to know that in my 30 years of military service, I've never seen training innovations have this kind of immediate, measurable impact on operational effectiveness. What you've built here is something special." That evening, Sarah drove back to San Diego and stopped by the Bell and Grind, which she had kept operating under the management of her former assistant manager. The space felt smaller than she remembered, the quiet routine that once represented her entire world now seeming like a relic from a different life. Mrs. Patterson was still there, reading romance novels in her corner booth and ordering the same medium dark roast with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. But now she waved to Sarah like an old friend, rather than a regular customer, aware of the military training work that had gradually taken over Sarah's life. "How's the teaching going, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Well," Sarah replied, "better than I expected when I started. You look happier than you did when you were here every day. More purpose in your step."
The observation was accurate. Sarah did feel more purposeful, more connected to meaningful work than she had during her 3 years of hiding behind the coffee counter. But she also felt the weight of decisions that could affect thousands of lives, responsibilities that extended far beyond her own recovery and healing. As she sat in the quiet coffee shop, surrounded by the peaceful environment she'd created as a sanctuary from her military past, Sarah realized that she'd come full circle. The woman who'd started serving coffee to avoid her combat experience had become someone who used that experience to help others prepare for the same challenges she'd survived. The choice Colonel Reeves had presented wasn't really about whether to expand her training program. It was about whether she was ready to fully embrace the role that had emerged from her willingness to stop hiding from her past. Sarah pulled out her phone and typed a message to Colonel Reeves. "I'm ready to discuss the TRADOC position. When do we start?" As she sent the message, Sarah felt the last vestiges of her civilian sanctuary falling away, replaced by a sense of purpose that connected directly to the values that had originally drawn her to military service. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her experience. She was using both to help ensure that other people would be better prepared to face the challenges she'd survived. The coffee shop would always be here if she needed it, a reminder of the peace she'd found during her recovery. But her future lay in using her hardest-won knowledge to help others, in taking the lessons learned through trauma and transforming them into preparation that could save lives. It was time to stop serving coffee and start changing the world, one well-trained medic at a time. 1 year later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, the home of Army medical training, addressing a group of 200 combat medics preparing for their first deployments. The students represented every corner of the country and every background imaginable, but they all shared the common goal of learning to save lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable. "How many of you have been in a firefight?" Sarah asked the group. No hands went up, exactly as she expected. These were new medics, fresh from advanced individual training, who had learned procedures and protocols, but hadn't yet faced the reality of applying their knowledge under enemy fire. "How many of you think your training has prepared you for performing emergency surgery while under attack?" About half the hands went up, then slowly lowered as students began to question their own confidence. "Here's what I want you to understand," Sarah continued, clicking to a slide showing statistics from recent deployments.
63% of combat medics report feeling unprepared for the psychological demands of battlefield medicine during their first real emergency. Not the technical demands. You know the procedures. The psychological demands of making life or death decisions while people are shooting at you. The classroom was completely silent. 200 young medics absorbing the reality of what they'd volunteered for. But here's the good news, Sarah said, advancing to the next slide. Units that have completed enhanced stress inoculation training report 89% confidence in their ability to perform under combat conditions. That's what we're going to spend the next 2 weeks building. The training program Sarah had developed for conventional forces was an adaptation of her special operations curriculum, modified for larger groups and shorter timelines, but maintaining the core principles of environmental realism and stress inoculation. Over the past year, she'd personally trained more than 3,000 combat medics across 15 different installations with consistently positive results. But more importantly, she'd begun receiving reports from deployed units whose medics had completed her training. Stories of successful trauma care performed under fire, of lives saved because medics had been prepared for the psychological challenges of combat medicine, of young soldiers who'd kept their composure during mass casualty events because they'd practiced similar scenarios during training. Each report represented vindication of her decision to stop hiding from her military experience and start using it to help others. "Ma'am," one of the students raised her hand, "is it true that you developed this training based on your own combat experience?" Sarah nodded. "It is. During my third deployment to Afghanistan, I spent 4 hours treating casualties while under enemy fire. Everything we're going to practice over the next 2 weeks is based on what I learned during that experience, both about what works and what I wish I'd been better prepared for." Another student spoke up. "What was the hardest part?" The question was one Sarah had learned to expect, and she'd developed a comprehensive answer that was honest without being unnecessarily graphic. But looking at these young medics, so eager, so committed, so unaware of what lay ahead of them, she decided to give them the unvarnished truth. The hardest part wasn't any individual procedure or technical challenge. It was maintaining clear thinking and effective decision-making while everything around me was falling apart, while I was bleeding, while people were shooting at me, while I had more casualties than I could possibly treat adequately with the supplies I had available. She paused, letting that reality sink in. The procedures you've learned are solid. The techniques work. But performing them when you're scared, when you're under fire, when you have to choose which patient to treat first because you can't treat them all, that requires a different kind of preparation. "Is that what this training provides?" a third student asked. "That's exactly what this training provides. By the time you leave here, you'll have performed every procedure you might need under conditions that approximate real combat stress. You'll have made triage decisions with limited resources. You'll have experienced the adrenaline dump that comes with life or death situations, and you'll know how to channel that energy into effective performance rather than panic." The 2-week training program was intensive and demanding. Students worked through progressively challenging scenarios, starting with individual procedures performed under mild stress and building to complex mass casualty events with full environmental simulation. By the final week, they were performing advanced trauma care while being subjected to strobe lights, loud audio, and time pressure designed to replicate actual combat conditions. But the most valuable component, Sarah had learned, was the integration of her personal experience into the technical instruction. She shared stories from her deployments not as entertainment, but as case studies that illustrated both successful techniques and costly mistakes. The students learned not just how to perform procedures, but why certain approaches worked better under stress and how to adapt when situations didn't match textbook scenarios. On the final day of training, Sarah watched the last group work through their culminating exercise, a scenario based directly on her own final deployment experience, with multiple casualties requiring immediate intervention while under simulated enemy fire. The students moved with confidence and precision, making good decisions under pressure and effectively prioritizing their efforts to save the maximum number of lives. Watching them work, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life since her medical discharge. These young medics were better prepared for deployment than she had been, not just because of improved technical training, but because they'd been inoculated against the psychological challenges that had taken her years to process. After the exercise concluded and the students dispersed to their assignments, Sarah received a message that stopped her in her tracks. It was from Corporal Walsh, the young Marine who'd first approached her for additional training at the coffee shop more than a year ago. "Ma'am, wanted to let you know that I just completed my first deployment with Force Recon. We had a mass casualty event during our 3rd week in country, and I was the senior medical personnel on scene. The training you gave us, both the informal sessions and the formal program, made all the difference. Everyone came home. Thank you for preparing us for what we actually faced out there." The message was followed by a photo, Walsh and his team all alive and accounted for, standing in front of their transport aircraft after returning from deployment. Sarah stared at the image for several minutes, thinking about the chain of events that had led from her hiding behind a coffee counter to these young Marines coming home safely from their first combat deployment. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Morrison. "Sarah, we just got word that Defense Department leadership wants to expand your training program to all services, Marines, Air Force, even Coast Guard medical personnel. They're asking if you'd be willing to take on a position as Director of Combat Medical Training Integration for the entire Department of Defense." Sarah read the message twice, processing the implications. What started as curriculum consulting for a small Navy unit had evolved into responsibility for combat medical training across the entire U.S. military. It was an opportunity to influence the preparation of every combat medic who would serve in the coming decade, to ensure that her hard-won knowledge would benefit not just the thousands she'd personally trained, but tens of thousands of future personnel. But it was also a level of responsibility that would require her to fully embrace the identity she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. She walked outside the training facility and found herself looking up at the Texas sky, thinking about the journey that had brought her from a wounded veteran hiding her scars to someone whose experience was helping shape military training at the highest levels. The woman who served coffee every morning to avoid conversations about her military experience had become someone who used her combat experience to prepare others for the same challenges she'd survived. The scars that had once been sources of shame and painful memories had become teaching tools that helped save lives. Sarah pulled up Colonel Reeves's contact information and placed a call. "Colonel, this is Sarah. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the DoD position." "And?" "I'm ready to discuss terms. When do we start?" As she ended the call, she realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her experience. She was using both to ensure that the next generation of combat medics would be better prepared than she had been to face the challenges of battlefield medicine. The coffee shop in San Diego still existed, still serving the same regulars who had unknowingly watched her begin this journey. But the woman who served coffee every morning until Navy SEALs spotted her combat scars was gone, replaced by someone who had turned her trauma into purpose and her experience into hope for others. It had taken her 4 years to understand that her scars weren't something to hide from, but something to learn from. And now those lessons would help prepare an entire generation of military medical personnel to save lives when it mattered most. The journey from hiding to healing to helping was complete. The next chapter would be about ensuring that no combat medic would ever have to face the challenges she'd survived without the benefit of her hard-won knowledge. Sarah Martinez had found her calling, and it was bigger than she'd ever imagined possible.
5 years later, Sarah Martinez stood behind the counter of the Bell and Grind coffee house, but everything had changed. The small coffee shop had become the headquarters for the Martinez Institute for Combat Medical Training, a civilian organization that provided advanced medical training to military personnel from around the world. The back room where she'd once stored coffee supplies now housed state-of-the-art medical simulation equipment, and the quiet space where she'd hidden from her past had become a hub of activity focused on preparing others for the challenges she'd survived. Mrs. Patterson still sat in her corner booth with her romance novels, but now she was joined by retired military officers, active-duty medical personnel on temporary assignment, and international visitors who'd come to San Diego specifically to train with the woman who'd revolutionized combat medical education. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After accepting the position as Director of Combat Medical Training Integration for the Department of Defense, Sarah had spent 3 years traveling constantly, implementing her training methods at bases across the country and overseas. She'd worked with NATO allies to standardize combat medical training, consulted with civilian trauma centers to improve emergency medical protocols, and testified before congressional committees about the importance of realistic medical training for deployed personnel. But throughout all of that work, she'd maintained the Bell and Grind as her home base, the place where her journey had begun and where she could always return to remember how far she'd come. This morning was special, though. Today marked the 5th anniversary of the day Morrison and his team had first walked into her coffee shop and recognized her as something more than a civilian barista. To commemorate the occasion, Sarah had invited everyone who'd been part of her journey to join her for coffee and reflection. Morrison arrived first, now a full colonel, but still carrying himself with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized their first encounter. He was followed by Colonel Reeves, recently promoted to Brigadier General, and behind her came a group of young service members who represented the thousands Sarah had trained over the past 5 years. Among them was Corporal Walsh, now a staff sergeant with 3 successful deployments under his belt, each one made safer by the training he'd received in this very coffee shop. His team had become legendary within Marine Force Recon for their medical capabilities, earning commendations for lives saved under fire and successful casualty evacuation from hostile territory. "Ma'am," Walsh said, approaching the counter with the respect he'd always shown her, "it's an honor to be here for this anniversary." "The honor is mine, Staff Sergeant. You and your Marines proved that this training works when it matters most." As the group gathered around tables that had been arranged specifically for the occasion, Sarah found herself reflecting on the statistical impact of the work that had started in this small coffee shop. Combat medical mortality rates across all services had decreased by 42% since her training methods had been implemented. More than 50,000 military medical personnel had completed programs based on her curriculum. And most importantly, she'd received over 300 letters from deployed medics reporting successful life-saving interventions that they attributed directly to their training. But beyond the statistics were the personal stories. Young medics who'd written to thank her for preparing them to handle their first combat casualty, unit commanders who'd reported improved confidence and performance in their medical personnel, and families who'd gotten their sons and daughters home alive because someone had been properly trained to provide emergency care under fire. General Morrison called the group to attention, a gesture of respect rather than military formality. 5 years ago, Sarah Martinez was hiding her military experience behind this coffee counter, trying to build a life separate from the trauma she'd experienced during deployment. Today, she's responsible for combat medical training programs that have saved hundreds of lives and improved the readiness of thousands of military medical personnel. She paused, looking around the room at the assembled group. But more importantly, she's proven that our most valuable training resources aren't found in textbooks or computer simulations. They're found in the experiences of the men and women who've actually faced these challenges and survived them. Sarah, your willingness to transform your trauma into training has changed how we prepare our people for combat, and we're all better for it. The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah felt compelled to share credit with the people who'd made the journey possible. 5 years ago, I was broken, she said, addressing the group. I'd survived my deployments physically, but I was hiding from everything that reminded me of military service. I thought healing meant forgetting, that recovery required separation from anything connected to my combat experience. She gestured around the coffee shop, taking in the space where her transformation had begun. But this place taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to use your experience in ways that serve something larger than your own recovery. Command Sergeant Major Morrison and his team didn't just recognize my military background, they helped me understand that my experience had value beyond my own healing process. Sarah looked at the young service members in the group, seeing in their faces the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty she'd once carried into her own deployments. But the real heroes in this story are the people who took that training and used it to save lives when everything was falling apart around them. Staff Sergeant Walsh and his Marines, the Navy corpsmen who've written to tell me about successful trauma care performed under fire, the Army medics who've used stress inoculation training to maintain clear thinking during mass casualty events, they're the ones who proved that this approach works. She paused, thinking about the young Marines who'd first approached her for additional training, how their eagerness to learn had helped her realize that her experience could serve a purpose beyond her own healing process. The most important lesson I've learned over the past 5 years is that our hardest experiences don't have to define us as victims. They can shape us as resources for helping others face similar challenges. Every scar, every nightmare, every moment of doubt I experienced during my recovery became a teaching tool that helped prepare someone else to handle situations I understood intimately. Sarah walked to the window where she'd spent so many mornings watching civilian life pass by while trying to forget her military service. Now, the same view reminded her of how much had changed, not just in her own life, but in the lives of the thousands of people who'd benefited from training based on her combat experience. 3 months ago, I received a letter from a young Air Force pararescue medic deployed to Syria. He was part of a team that came under fire while evacuating casualties from a helicopter crash. Using techniques he'd learned during our training program, he managed to keep 5 critically injured aircrew alive during a 6-hour firefight until they could be extracted to a medical facility. She pulled the letter from her pocket, the paper worn from repeated reading. "Ma'am, I wanted you to know that your training made the difference between 5 families getting their loved ones back and 5 families receiving folded flags. The stress inoculation and resource management techniques you taught us turned what could have been a catastrophic loss into a successful rescue. We all came home because you were willing to share what you learned the hard way." The room was completely silent, everyone understanding the weight of what Sarah was sharing. This letter represents everything this journey has been about, taking the worst experience of my military career and transforming it into preparation that helped someone else succeed where I almost failed. Morrison stood and walked to the counter where Sarah had first served him coffee, the same spot where their professional relationship had begun with mutual recognition between veterans. "Sarah, there's something else we wanted to share with you today," he said, producing a formal-looking document from his briefcase. "The Department of Defense has approved the establishment of the Sarah Martinez Combat Medical Training Center at Fort Sam Houston. It will be the first military training facility named after an enlisted soldier, and it will serve as the primary location for advanced combat medical training across all services." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the implications sank in. Having a military facility named in her honor was in recognition she'd never imagined possible, especially for someone who'd left military service as a medically retired sergeant. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll continue the work you've started," General Reeves interjected. "The facility will need a director, someone who understands both the technical requirements and the philosophical approach that makes this training effective." The offer represented the culmination of everything Sarah had worked toward over the past 5 years, but it also meant leaving behind the coffee shop that had been her sanctuary and foundation through the entire journey. She looked around the space that had sheltered her during her recovery, where she'd first begun to understand that her military experience could be a resource rather than just a source of trauma. The bell and grind had been her hiding place, her healing space, and finally her launching point for work that had influenced military medical training around the world. "I'll take the position," she said, "but I want to maintain this place as a satellite location. The Martinez Institute started here, and I think it's important to remember that some of our most valuable training innovations come from people who've been broken and found ways to rebuild themselves." The agreement was unanimous, and as the formal portion of the gathering concluded, Sarah found herself back behind the counter, serving coffee to the people who'd helped transform her life. But this time,
Instead of hiding her scars, she was sharing stories about how those scars had become teaching tools. Instead of avoiding conversations about military service, she was planning training programs that would prepare the next generation of combat medics. Mrs. Patterson approached the counter as the military personnel began to disperse. "Dear, I've been watching you serve coffee in this shop for 8 years now, and I've never seen you look as happy as you do today. I think I finally figured out what I'm supposed to be doing with my life." "And what's that?" Sarah looked around the coffee shop that had been her refuge, her classroom, and her headquarters for work that had saved hundreds of lives. She thought about the young medics who would train at the facility that would bear her name, about the families who would welcome home sons and daughters because someone had been properly prepared to provide emergency medical care under impossible conditions. "Helping people prepare for challenges I hope they never have to face," she said, "using the worst experiences of my life to help ensure that other people are better prepared for similar situations." As the afternoon wound down and the last of the anniversary gathering participants departed, Sarah found herself alone in the coffee shop for the first time in months. The space felt different now, not like a hiding place, but like a foundation. The woman who'd served coffee every morning to avoid conversations about her military service had become someone who used her combat experience to prepare others for the same challenges she'd survived. The scars on her arm were still there, still visible when her sleeves rode up during busy periods. But now, instead of sources of shame and painful memories, they were reminders of knowledge gained through hard experience, symbols of survival that had been transformed into hope for others. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from a young Navy corpsman currently deployed to Africa. "Ma'am, used your mass casualty triage protocols during a vehicle accident today. Probably saved 2 lives. Thank you for teaching us to think clearly when everything is falling apart." She smiled, typing back, "Stay safe out there. Bring everyone home." As she began the familiar routine of closing the coffee shop, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a wounded veteran hiding her military background to someone whose experience was helping shape the training of military medical personnel around the world. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been nights when preparing training scenarios had triggered nightmares, days when sharing her combat experiences had left her emotionally exhausted, and moments when she had questioned whether exposing herself to psychological challenges was worth the potential benefit to her trainees. But there had also been letters from deployed personnel who'd used her training to save lives in real combat situations, reports from commanders about improved medical performance in their units, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that her hardest-won knowledge was helping other people survive challenges she understood better than almost anyone else. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of transitioning from the small coffee shop that had been her sanctuary to the military training facility that would bear her name. She would move from training hundreds of personnel to overseeing programs that would prepare thousands. The work would be more demanding, the responsibility greater, and the impact potentially profound. But tonight, she was content to stand in the quiet coffee shop where her journey had begun, surrounded by the peaceful environment she'd created as a refuge from her past, and which had become the foundation for work that gave meaning to her future. The woman who'd served coffee every morning until Navy SEALs spotted her combat scars had discovered that her scars were not sources of shame, but symbols of knowledge that could help save lives. Her journey from hiding to healing to helping was complete, but the work of using her experience to benefit others was just beginning. Sarah Martinez had found her calling, and it was bigger than she'd ever imagined possible. But it started here, in a small coffee shop, with the simple recognition that her experience had value beyond her own recovery. As she turned off the lights and locked the door, Sarah knew she would be back. The bell and grind would always be here, a reminder of where she'd started and how far she'd come. But her future lay in using her hardest-won knowledge to ensure that no combat medic would ever have to face the challenges she'd survived without the benefit of proper preparation. The coffee shop had been her sanctuary. Now it was time to make the whole world a little safer, one well-trained medic at a time.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.